Picture this. It's August 29th, 1911. The morning sun beats down on the dusty outskirts of Oroville, California, where Sheriff J.B. Weber is having what might be the strangest day of his career. Standing before him is a man unlike anyone he's ever encountered, lean, weathered, wearing only a torn canvas shirt. The man speaks no English, carries no identification, and clutches a short wooden bow that looks like something from a museum display. What Sheriff Weber doesn't realize, what nobody could possibly realize in that moment, is that he's looking at the last living bridge to 10,000 years of human innovation. This is Ishi, and the weapon in his hands represents one of the most sophisticated technologies ever developed by human beings. We're not talking about some primitive stick and string here. We're talking about the culmination of millennia of engineering, biomechanics, and survival instinct refined to an art form that would revolutionize everything Western civilization thought it knew about archery. Now, when I say revolutionary, I want you to understand the scale we're dealing with. Imagine if tomorrow someone walked out of the Amazon rainforest carrying the secret to faster-than-light travel. Except, instead of violating the laws of physics, they're demonstrating the laws of human potential that we'd simply forgotten existed. That's closer to what we're looking at here. Ishi's bow measured barely 4 feet long, and that's important. While European archers were lugging around 6-foot English longbows that required the strength of a draft horse just to draw, Ishi carried lightning in a package small enough to maneuver through dense forest without catching on every branch. The wood itself tells a story. Mountain juniper heartwood, selected not through some casual walk in the woods, but through what his people understood as conversations with the tree's spirit. Now, before you roll your eyes at that spiritual language, understand that what they were really doing was identifying the perfect grain structure, moisture content, and cellular density through generations of accumulated knowledge that made modern materials science look like finger painting. But here's where it gets really interesting. The bow itself wasn't even the revolutionary part. The revolution was happening in Ishi's thumb. Every Western archer, every single one, used what they pompously called the Mediterranean draw. 3 fingers hooked around the string, pulling back to the corner of the mouth or the ear. It was the civilized way, the proper technique taught in every archery manual from London to Vienna. Ishi looked at this technique the way you might look at someone trying to drive a car with their feet. Instead, he hooked his thumb around the bowstring and locked it in place with his index finger. This wasn't some quaint native custom or primitive approximation of real archery. This was a biomechanical masterpiece that engaged completely different muscle groups, distributed strain more efficiently, and allowed for a type of accuracy that made European techniques look like amateur hour at summer camp. When Saxton Pope, the University of California anthropologist who first studied Ishi, watched him demonstrate this technique, he initially tried to correct it. Picture the arrogance there for a moment. Here's a man whose ancestors had been perfecting this art for 10,000 years, and Pope wanted to fix his form based on what he'd read in English sporting manuals. It's like trying to teach Mozart how to play piano because you took lessons at the local community center. But then Ishi started shooting. At 40 yards, and this is documented, witnessed, recorded, he could shatter glass bottles with arrows he'd crafted himself from dogwood shoots. Not sometimes. Consistently. The kind of accuracy that made Pope's jaw drop and his academic certainty crumble like cheap plaster. The thumb draw brought the arrow to Ishi's chest rather than his ear, creating a completely different anchor point that allowed for what modern sports scientists would later call instinctive shooting, the ability to hit targets without conscious aiming, purely through muscle memory and spatial awareness. Think about the implications of that for a moment. While European military archers were lining up in formations, consciously aiming at massed enemy formations and hoping volume of fire would compensate for individual inaccuracy, native hunters were developing personal relationships with their weapons that bordered on telepathy. Each shot had to count because there were no supply wagons, no armories, no industrial production. Miss your shot at a deer, and your family might go hungry. Miss your shot at a charging bear, and you might not live to miss again. The economics of survival had shaped every aspect of native archery over thousands of years. Where English armies could afford to waste arrows in volleys, They had entire industries dedicated to arrow production. Native hunters operated under completely different constraints. They needed maximum efficiency from minimum resources, which drove innovations that military archery never even considered. Different tribes across the continent had developed their own variations of the thumb draw, each adapted to specific hunting conditions and prey animals. The Lakota developed a modified version that allowed them to hold multiple arrows in their bow hand, achieving rates of fire that would later astound cavalry officers who thought they understood rapid shooting. Apache hunters used a pinch draw for their incredibly powerful sinew-backed bows, generating enough force to drive arrows completely through buffalo ribs, a feat that required both perfect technique and absolute precision. But here's the tragedy that makes Ishi's emergence so remarkable. By 1911, these techniques were on the verge of extinction. The first, reservation era, roughly 1870 to 1910, had systematically targeted traditional practices for destruction. Government agents didn't just confiscate bows, they banned traditional hunting, forced native children into boarding schools where practicing ancestral skills meant punishment severe enough to break spirits. An entire generation grew up severed from their archery heritage, their muscle memory of ancient draws fading like smoke in wind. Yet somehow, impossibly, Ishi had preserved it all. Hidden in the mountains of Northern California, the last of the Yahi people had maintained techniques that connected him directly to his ancestors crossing the Bering Land Bridge. Every element of his archery, from the selection of wood to the final release of the string, carried forward knowledge that predated written history. When Sheriff Weber looked at that short bow in Ishi's hands, he was looking at technology that would soon transform American archery completely. Within a generation, hunters and target shooters across the country would be experimenting with thumb draws and instinctive shooting. The revolution was about to begin, sparked by a man who carried the last fragments of a vanished world. But first, Ishi had to survive the encounter with civilization that had already destroyed everything else he'd ever known. 500 years after Christ, the bow arrived in North America carried by peoples crossing the Bering Land Bridge. But the real revolution, the moment that would create the finest mounted archers the world had ever seen, that happened 1,000 years later when Spanish conquistadors brought something they never intended to share: horses. Picture the moment sometime around 1600 when a Comanche warrior first swung his leg over a horse's back with a bow in his hand. What happened next wasn't just tactical innovation, it was the birth of a new form of warfare that would dominate the Great Plains for 2 centuries, and leave European military theorists scratching their heads in bewilderment. Within 2 generations, tribes like the Comanche had transformed from pedestrian hunters into cavalry forces that could ride circles around the best European horsemen while shooting with deadly accuracy. But here's what makes this transformation so remarkable. They weren't just adapting existing techniques to horseback. They were reinventing archery from the ground up. The biomechanical challenges of shooting from horseback are staggering when you really think about them. You're dealing with a moving platform that's bouncing, turning, accelerating, and decelerating unpredictably. Your target is probably moving too. You need to maintain perfect balance while drawing a bow that might require 60 pounds of force, all while your mount is thundering across uneven terrain at 30 miles per hour. Oh, and people are shooting back at you. European cavalry had solved this problem by abandoning archery entirely in favor of firearms and lances. The Comanche looked at this same problem and developed techniques so sophisticated that modern Olympic equestrian archers still study their methods. The key innovation was what they called the horse bow draw, a specialized version of the thumb draw that allowed them to shoot from beneath their horses' necks. Think about the genius of this for a moment. By hanging off the side of their mount, Comanche warriors could use their horses as living shields while maintaining a shooting position. The enemy saw only hooves and arrows, with the archer completely protected behind 1,500 pounds of muscle and bone. Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota war chief, turned this technique into an art form during the 1860s. His mounted warriors could loose 20 arrows in the time it took a cavalry trooper to reload his single-shot carbine once. And these weren't wild shots sprayed in the general direction of the enemy. These were precision shots placed with surgical accuracy even at full gallop. The shortest Lakota warbow measured just 38 inches, perfectly engineered for horseback maneuvers. A 6-foot English longbow would have been useless on horseback. Try drawing something that tall while hanging off the side of a galloping horse, and you'll understand why. But those compact native bows could drive an arrow completely through a cavalry horse at 50 yards. We're talking about arrows punching through ribs, organs, and out the other side with enough force remaining to wound the rider. This wasn't accident or luck. This was precision engineering developed through generations of warfare and hunting. Every element of plains archery equipment was optimized for mounted combat. The arrows themselves were shorter and heavier than infantry arrows, designed to maintain trajectory when shot from a moving platform. The bow grips were wrapped with specific materials that provided perfect traction even when hands were slick with sweat or blood. But the truly revolutionary aspect went far deeper than mechanics. It was spiritual and cultural in ways that European military doctrine couldn't comprehend. Among the Cheyenne, a boy's first bow came not from a craftsman's shop, but from a vision quest where spirits revealed his personal drawing style. Some received the gift of the thumb draw, others the ancient pinch draw of their ancestors. This wasn't superstition, it was sophisticated biomechanical assessment wrapped in spiritual language. The making of a warbow required 40 days of preparation, including purification, ceremonies and songs that warriors believed infused the wood with protective power. Every geometric pattern painted on the bow limbs told a story, creating identification systems so precise that warriors could claim their arrows from a battlefield by recognizing their unique markings in flight. Imagine the visual acuity required to identify your arrow among dozens flying through smoky chaos at combat speeds. Trading posts in the 1700s became unlikely laboratories where native techniques encountered European materials. Iron arrowheads from French traders doubled penetration power, but they also changed the balance and weight distribution of arrows, requiring adjustments to drawing techniques and release timing. Some plains warriors began experimenting with modified Mediterranean draws when using European trade goods, creating hybrid techniques that confused military observers who tried to categorize their methods. The Crow Nation developed perhaps the most ingenious innovation, a quick-release technique using leather thumb rings acquired through trade networks stretching to Asia. These rings allowed them to maintain their traditional thumb draw while preventing the string cuts that plagued bare thumb shooters during extended battles. The rings also enabled a faster release cycle, critical advantage when facing enemies armed with repeating firearms. Government suppression of native archery skills intensified dramatically after the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Military commanders had learned the hard way that native archery made their warriors formidable opponents despite facing technological disadvantages. A mounted Lakota archer with 40 arrows could engage an entire cavalry troop and ride away largely unscathed, picking off horses and riders with methodical precision. General Philip Sheridan, architect of the post-Civil War Indian campaigns, explicitly ordered the confiscation of all bows on reservations, calling them weapons of resistance that perpetuate savage warfare. Indian agents measured their success by how many traditional bows they could destroy, burning thousands of masterworks that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. These weren't just weapons being destroyed, these were libraries, textbooks, and doctoral dissertations in biomechanics all rolled into 4 feet of carved wood and sinew. At institutions like the Carlisle Indian School, children caught practicing traditional archery faced solitary confinement and starvation rations. The goal was explicit: break the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. If you could prevent native children from learning their ancestral skills, you could eliminate the military threat they represented. But resistance took forms that authorities never anticipated. Native scouts employed by the army secretly maintained their traditional skills, teaching thumb draws and instinctive shooting to their children in pre-dawn darkness. Black Elk, the famous Lakota holy man, hid bows in sacred bundles, preserving not just the weapons but the ceremonies and songs that accompanied their creation. Women, traditionally excluded from warrior archery, became secret keepers of bow-making knowledge, memorizing recipes for hide glue and sinew preparation that their imprisoned husbands whispered through cell bars. The irony was devastating. At the very moment when plains archery reached its technical pinnacle, when centuries of innovation had created the most effective mounted archery system in human history, the entire tradition faced systematic extinction. Warriors who could place arrows with sniper-like precision from horseback were forced to watch their bows burn while their children were beaten for even mentioning the old ways. Yet somehow, impossibly, fragments survived. Hidden in remote camps, practiced in secret ceremonies, whispered between generations who refused to let the knowledge die. The lightning was still there, waiting in the wood, ready for someone brave enough to call it back. When Saxton Pope walked into that University of California museum in 1911 to meet Ishii, he thought he was documenting the death rattle of a primitive technology. What he actually became was the first student in a revolution that would transform American archery forever. Pope arrived with all the confidence of Western academic superiority. He'd studied archery from English sporting manuals, practiced the Mediterranean draw at gentlemen's clubs, and considered himself quite accomplished with a bow. He fully intended to help Ishii by correcting his obviously flawed technique and introducing him to proper European methods. The arrogance of that moment is almost breathtaking when you consider it like trying to teach Einstein arithmetic because you'd mastered multiplication tables. But then Ishii started shooting. The first demonstration shattered more than glass bottles. It shattered Pope's entire understanding of what archery could be. Here was a man using a technique that Pope had dismissed as primitive, consistently outperforming him at every distance with equipment that looked handmade compared to Pope's fine English sporting bow. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. Pope's scientific mind, to his credit, eventually overcame his cultural prejudice. He began taking notes that would become the foundation of what we now call traditional archery. But the process required him to unlearn everything he thought he knew and approach Ishii's methods with genuine humility. It's a rare moment in history when you can pinpoint the exact instant that 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge began flowing back into the modern world. The revolution spread through channels that nobody could have predicted. Will Compton, watching Ishii's demonstrations in 1914, noticed something that European bowmakers had missed completely. The thumb draw eliminated the string torque that plagued Mediterranean shooters. Torque, the twisting force that throws arrows off target, had been accepted as an inevitable part of archery. But Ishii's technique virtually eliminated it through the biomechanics of the thumb release. Compton began manufacturing bows with shelf cuts on the opposite side to accommodate what he called the American draw. The irony of that name is profound. He was marketing ancient native techniques as American innovations, erasing their indigenous origins even as he profited from their superiority. Within 5 years, archery suppliers across the country were producing equipment designed around native techniques while carefully avoiding any mention of their actual source. Howard Hill, who would become the greatest exhibition archer in Hollywood history, spent hours studying films of Ishii frame by frame. Hill incorporated the chest anchor point into his trick shooting repertoire, using it to achieve the rapid-fire sequences that made him famous in movies like The Adventures of Robin Hood. But Hill understood what he was borrowing. He called Ishii the greatest archer who ever lived, and credited native techniques for his own success. By 1920, archery clubs across America were quietly experimenting with native techniques, though few acknowledged their indigenous origins. The results spoke for themselves. Archers using thumb draws and instinctive shooting methods dominated competitions, forcing the National Archery Association to create separate categories for traditional and American styles. The distinction was purely political, a way to avoid admitting that native techniques were simply superior. The scientific documentation of what Ishii demonstrated revealed biomechanical advantages that Western archery had completely missed. High-speed photography in 1925 showed that the thumb release created significantly less string oscillation than Mediterranean draws, explaining the superior accuracy that observers had noted but couldn't explain. The physics were clear. Less string movement meant more consistent arrow flight, but the advantages went deeper than just release mechanics. The thumb draw engaged the larger muscles of the back and shoulders, rather than relying primarily on arm strength. This meant native archers could maintain their shooting performance much longer than European-trained archers, who tired quickly during extended shooting sessions. For hunters who might need to track wounded game for hours, this endurance advantage could mean the difference between eating and starving. Perhaps most remarkably, the instinctive aiming method that Ishii demonstrated activated completely different neural pathways than the conscious aiming techniques taught in European archery schools. Modern sports science has confirmed what native hunters knew intuitively. Instinctive shooting creates faster reaction times and better performance against moving targets. The conscious mind, with all its calculations and corrections, simply couldn't process information fast enough for hunting situations. Art Young, Pope's hunting companion, became an unlikely evangelist for native techniques after a humbling experience in 1913. He and Pope were hunting deer with Ishii when a large buck appeared at 35 yards. Young, using his carefully aimed Mediterranean technique, missed cleanly. Ishii immediately drew and released, dropping the deer with a single arrow through the heart. The shot took less than 3 seconds from draw to impact. That moment converted Young completely. He began teaching hybrid techniques at the California Archery Club, combining Ishii's thumb draw with modern equipment and hunting methods. His students dominated West Coast competitions throughout the 1920s, creating a new generation of archers who understood that the primitive techniques were actually more advanced than anything Europe had developed. The preservation of Ishii's knowledge became a desperate race against time. As tuberculosis, the gift of civilization, weakened his body, Pope and anthropologist Alfred Kroeber frantically documented every aspect of his archery knowledge. They filmed his bow construction process, recorded the songs he sang while selecting arrow wood, and made detailed plaster casts of his hands to preserve the exact thumb and finger positions of his draw. The documentation process revealed the staggering complexity of what appeared to be simple techniques. Ishii's bowmaking alone involved over 60 distinct steps, each requiring precise timing and technique. The selection of sinew for backing involved understanding seasonal variations in deer physiology. The hide glue recipes required knowledge of temperature control and mixture ratios that modern chemists found impressively sophisticated. When Ishii died in 1916, he left behind 47 bows, over 200 arrows, and detailed notes that would influence archery development for the next century. But more than equipment, he left behind a complete philosophical approach to archery that emphasized harmony between archer, bow, and environment, rather than the mechanical precision that dominated European methods. His last words to Pope were instructions for a particularly difficult sinew backing technique that modern bowyers still struggle to replicate. Even with detailed notes and photographs, contemporary craftsmen often fail to achieve the consistent results that Ishii produced with what appeared to be casual ease. The knowledge was more than technical, it was cultural, spiritual, and deeply embedded in ways of thinking that couldn't be captured in academic documentation. But the seeds had been planted. Across America, archers were discovering that the old ways weren't primitive approximations of proper technique. They were sophisticated solutions to problems that European archery had never even recognized. The thunder was beginning to return, carried by people who understood that innovation sometimes means remembering what we'd forgotten rather than inventing something entirely new. The question now was whether this rediscovered knowledge could survive in a world that had systematically tried to destroy it, and whether its revival could somehow honor the people who had preserved it through generations of persecution. By 1950, something extraordinary was happening in the mountains and reservations across North America. Native people who had been forced to hide their archery knowledge for 3 generations were cautiously bringing their bows back into the light. The thunder that had been driven underground was beginning to rumble again, and this time the world was finally ready to listen. The revival began in the most unlikely places. At the Sherman Institute in Riverside, California, one of the very boarding schools that had once beaten children for practicing traditional skills, a pomo instructor named William Benson quietly began teaching traditional bow making in shop class. He called it woodworking, but his native students understood they were being handed back pieces of their stolen heritage. Within 5 years, Benson's students were crafting bows using techniques that their great-grandfathers had practiced in secret. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, Black Elk's nephew Oliver began organizing cultural demonstrations that were really training sessions for young Lakota men who had never held a traditional bow. These gatherings started small, a dozen teenagers learning to split arrow shafts in a garage, but word spread through informal networks that connected reservations across the Great Plains. By 1955, over 200 young Native men were practicing traditional archery techniques that had nearly vanished forever. The timing wasn't coincidental. The 1950s marked a fundamental shift in federal Indian policy, moving away from forced assimilation toward what officials called cultural preservation. But for Native communities, this wasn't about policy changes, it was about reclaiming their souls. The return of traditional archery represented something much deeper than recreational activity. It was the restoration of connection to ancestors, land, and identity that government schools had tried to sever. Dr. Compton's Archery Supply Company, now the largest manufacturer of traditional equipment in America, found itself in an awkward position. They'd built their business on native innovations while carefully erasing their indigenous origins. When Native communities began demanding recognition and respect for their contributions to modern archery, Compton faced a choice: continue the erasure or acknowledge the debt. To his credit, he chose acknowledgement, becoming one of the first major manufacturers to highlight the native origins of American traditional archery. But the real revolution was happening in places where corporations and academic institutions couldn't reach. On reservations and in urban Native communities, elders who had preserved fragments of knowledge in secret were finally finding young people eager to learn. Agnes Vanderberg, a Flathead elder from Montana, had hidden her father's bow-making tools in her basement for 40 years. In 1958, she brought them out to teach her grandson techniques that traced back to the buffalo days. The learning process wasn't simple recreation of old methods, it was active innovation building on traditional foundations. Native archers began experimenting with modern materials while preserving traditional techniques. Fiberglass replaced some sinew backing, but the layering patterns remained unchanged. Steel points replaced knapped stone, but the arrow construction followed ancient specifications. The result was equipment that honored tradition while incorporating useful modern improvements. Hollywood played an unexpected role in the revival. When Native actors like Jay Silverheels began appearing in Western films using authentic archery techniques rather than the theatrical approximations that had dominated earlier movies, audiences noticed the difference. Silverheels, a Mohawk actor famous for playing Tonto, insisted on using traditional thumb draws and instinctive shooting in his scenes. His accuracy on camera was so superior to other actors using Mediterranean techniques that directors began specifically requesting Native archers for action sequences. Fred Bear, the legendary bow hunter and manufacturer, became fascinated with Native techniques after meeting several traditional archers at a hunting exposition in 1962. Bear had built his reputation on precision and innovation. But when he watched elderly Native men consistently outshoot younger archers using modern equipment, he realized there were still lessons to learn. He began incorporating traditional designs into his manufacturing, creating hybrid bows that combined ancient wisdom with modern materials. The academic world slowly began acknowledging what Native communities had never forgotten, that traditional archery represented one of humanity's most sophisticated technologies. Biomechanics researchers at universities started studying Native techniques, publishing papers that confirmed what hunters had known for millennia. The thumb draw activated different muscle groups, providing better endurance. Instinctive shooting engaged neural pathways that improved reaction time. The chest anchor point created more consistent accuracy. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of Native-led organizations dedicated to preserving and teaching traditional archery. The Intertribal Archery Association, founded in 1965, created the first systematic programs for documenting and transmitting traditional techniques. Their instructors traveled between reservations, teaching young people skills their grandparents had practiced in secret. For the first time in nearly a century, traditional archery knowledge was flowing freely through Native communities. The revival faced challenges that went beyond technical training. Many young Native people had been raised in cities, disconnected from both reservation life and traditional practices. Teaching them archery meant also teaching them about wood selection, animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and spiritual practices that gave context to the techniques. It required rebuilding entire cultural frameworks that had been systematically dismantled. Mary Crow Dog, the Lakota activist and author, described learning traditional archery as remembering with my muscles. The thumb draw felt foreign at first, but after months of practice, it began feeling like something her body had always known. This experience, the deep familiarity of rediscovered tradition, became common among native people returning to ancestral practices. The knowledge seemed to be encoded not just in memory, but in genetic muscle patterns passed down through generations. By 1975, traditional archery had become a symbol of native cultural renaissance. Powwows featured archery competitions alongside dancing and drumming. Reservation schools began offering traditional archery as part of cultural education programs. Young native people who had grown up disconnected from their heritage found identity and pride in mastering skills their ancestors had perfected over millennia. The influence extended far beyond native communities. Non-native archers, humbled by the superior performance of traditional techniques, began seeking instruction from native teachers. Hunting clubs invited traditional archers to demonstrate instinctive shooting. Olympic coaches studied thumb draw mechanics. The archery world was finally beginning to understand that what they'd dismissed as primitive was actually more advanced than their own methods. Today, traditional archery thrives in ways that would have seemed impossible during the darkest years of suppression. Native craftsmen create bows that equal or exceed the performance of their ancestors' equipment. Traditional archery schools teach techniques that blend ancient wisdom with modern understanding. Museums that once displayed native bows as curiosities now showcase them as examples of sophisticated engineering. But the true measure of the revival isn't in competitions won or equipment sold. It's in young native people who can draw their ancestors' thunder from wood and sinew, who carry forward knowledge that survived genocide, suppression, and cultural erasure. When a Lakota teenager today hooks her thumb around a bowstring and feels the power that connected her great-great-grandmother to the buffalo herds, the circle completes itself. The lightning never left the wood. It was always there, waiting in the grain, holding the memory of 10,000 years of human innovation. All it needed was someone brave enough to call it home. And that thunder you hear rolling across the mountains today? That's the sound of ancient knowledge reclaiming its rightful place in the world, carried by people who understood that some traditions are too powerful to destroy, they can only be hidden until it's safe for them to return.